Joseph during a season, a prolonged season of waiting. And I don't know about you, I don't wait well. Um, we live in such an on-demand world that we don't really have to wait for much of anything at all these days. Like it used to be that if you wanted to watch your favorite show, you would have to tune in at a particular day, time, and channel. And now, of course, they have streaming services for the entire show if you want all there. In fact, pretty recently they started distributing the streaming show like one episode per week, even though it was all streaming. And that annoyed me something fierce. I'm like, I'm an adult, right? I'm an adult. I can be trusted with the entire show at this stage of my life. We don't wait well. We don't wait for anything well. And I looked this week at different people who had experienced prolonged periods of waiting. And the worst example I could find was there was a traffic jam in China in 2010 on China's National Highway 110 and the Beijing-Tibet Expressway. We've all been there. And for 62 miles, traffic was backed up. The entire traffic jam lasted as much as 12 days with thousands of vehicles being involved. They moved as slowly as 1 kilometer, less than a mile, per day. And they were stranded by up to 5 days. And what made matters worse is that they were doing road construction at the time and frequent breakdowns, bottlenecks, and overloaded trucks. Like it kept getting worse before it got better for the poor folks on the, the National Highway 110 and Beijing-Tibet Expressway. I don't know about you. I do not do well when I am waiting and cannot move forward no matter what it is I try to do. And we will have seasons in life where we find ourselves waiting for the next step forward, and it's not coming. It's not coming. And at this stage in our story, we have Joseph. Joseph was given this extraordinary dream where his family and his father would bow down to him. And because they were jealous, his brothers sold him into Egyptian slavery. And things were going well while he was in Potiphar's house for a while. And then, as we said last week, he met this, unsheathed cougar who accused him of sexual impropriety. And he was now condemned to Egyptian prison, okay? So in chapter 39, here's how it ends. This is how it ended last week. Just a quick review. So the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Wow, isn't that something? Like, wouldn't you like to aspire to one day being the king of the cell block, right? Like, that's where Joseph's life is at this point. And if we're reading this well, we see two realities parallel, two things being true at once. First, the Lord is with Joseph. We see that repeated twice in just that short section. We also see that all of Joseph's success here and now is confined to the Egyptian prison. He can have all the success he wants in that little confined area, but he's still in prison. And we know, spoiler alert, that he's in prison for at least 2 years before his release. Some Jewish traditions report that he was in prison for as long as 12 years. Now, Egyptian prison was not like, a super torturous experience, but they would have had, kind of meager provisions, meager meals, a lot of solitary kinds of experience. For Joseph to be in charge might have been kind of the best of the best, but again, still in Egyptian prison. His dream, his goal, his vision of having people bow down to him, having himself set up as ruler, was still a long way off. How many of us have had experiences where we have a dream in our life that seems a long, long, long way off? And sometimes that just happens. It just happens that things just don't work out the way that we expected or the way that we had planned those things to work. And we tell ourselves these little narratives of how things are supposed to be, how life is supposed to look for us in one particular moment. And when things don't go according to that story, we feel dejected and broken. For example, if you believe that if you do the right things, you have the right attitude, you have the right everything, you will meet the one and settle down and have a happy marriage, that may or may not come true. And there are some people in the world today who experience prolonged seasons of singleness where that story does not come true for them right away. I am one of them. I was a single man at the age of 35. And it long wait. Because a lot of young Christians go off to school looking for their MRS degree or the ring by spring or whatever else they say. And so if that does not happen for you, you feel like you are in a prolonged series of waiting in that traffic jam or whatever illustration you want to use. Your work, you might feel like you've put in the time, you've done all the extra credit, you've done everything your boss requires, and then some, gone above and beyond the latest contract, and still your coworkers get promoted ahead of you, and you don't get recognized for what you've done. In fact, you might actually just get fired. And it might seem tragically unfair. When that happens, how do we respond? How do we respond to waiting? How do we respond when our dreams don't come true? We can be frustrated. We can be jealous of those who do seem to have it all together. We can become really cynical and start to say things like, well, I didn't really need that job anyway. Or, hey, marriage is just a piece of paper. I don't need that kind of thing. And start doing kind of that sour grapes kind of rationalization, thinking maybe I'm just better off in the circumstance I'm in now and not trying to pursue anything else. And the resentment starts to build up. And we start to just become more cynical, more bitter, and start to become frustrated with ourselves, with other people, and maybe with God. Because waiting is hard. It's hard when the good things that you want aren't coming true. And if you've ever sat by a loved one's bedside with a tragic diagnosis, praying and waiting for God to come through, you know those periods of waiting can be extraordinarily, extraordinarily difficult. C.S. Lewis was onto something when he wrote his fictional story, Narnia. Remember the curse of Narnia, the witch, the evil queen? It was always winter, never Christmas. All the despair of winter and the blanket of snow, but never the joy of celebration of Christmas. There are seasons of life that might feel like that for us, when we are waiting for God to show up, waiting for God to come through for us, and it never seems to happen. What we need when we're sitting in that traffic jam of our personal experience is to see our lives from a different, higher vantage point and allow God's truth to reframe those experiences of waiting. We'll see that this morning in our text as we look at chapter 40. The first thing that we'll see is that where you need to be isn't always where you want to be. That where you're supposed to be is not necessarily where you think you're supposed to be. Where God places you is not necessarily the place that you would design if you were the author of your own story. Okay? So that's where Joseph is now. So it says in chapter 40, look at verse 1, sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Now, both of these positions would be high-ranking officials in Pharaoh's household in one form or another. Cupbearer meant that he was in charge of tasting Pharaoh's drinks and food to make sure no one poisoned him. And so for him to violate the king's trust would be a pretty severe penalty. So now the cupbearer and baker had offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. So once again, Joseph has this high position in prison where he's overseeing other prisoners. So here's what happens, verse 5. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker Each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." "Interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dreams." This, of course, is not the first time that Joseph and dreams have appeared in the same setting. In ancient societies, like long before Freudian psychoanalysis, they placed great stock in dreams. When you had a dream, it had to have meant something. It meant that the god or gods were somehow giving you a vision of what your life was shaping out to be. The problem was that in most ancient societies, not everyone had like the wherewithal or the skill set to assemble those dreams in a coherent, meaningful way. So Joseph is now there in prison overseeing these two guys, and he's had some experience in his life getting dreams, interpreting dreams, and knowing what's going on. So he is allowing God to use him now to interpret both of the dreams of these men. Now remember, a few weeks ago I mentioned that we were reading Joseph and the whole story of how he was having dreams about his family bowing down to him. And we said if you don't know this story, if you're reading the story for the very first time, you might find yourself wondering whether or not Joseph's dreams really were from God or whether they were just the product of his own self-inflated ego. This passage will help us understand that maybe Joseph does have some expertise in this area and that he is perfectly capable of interpreting dreams accurately and well, even for others. So, verse 9 says this. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. He said, "In my dream, I saw a grapevine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom, and soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup. Then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." So Joseph hears this and interprets it. So verse 12. "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." So he interprets the dream for the cupbearer in a really positive way. In 3 days, he's getting released from prison, early release, and getting back to his original post there by the king's side. So Joseph sees this as an important opportunity. And he's going to say, listen, I can now go to the king through this cupbearer and have him be kind of my advocate. And listen, we need justice established and justice restored for me, who was kidnapped, and I'm here against all circumstances, against my will. That's Joseph's hope. That's what Joseph wants to see happen. The cupbearer is his key to release. But here's what happens in the story. So we have the cupbearer's dream. Joseph makes his request. And then we have the baker's dream kind of coming along after it. So in verse 16, the baker, of course, is overhearing the whole thing. He's like, okay, wow, if this guy is right, then the cupbearer is due for release and promotion and restoration. So, okay, do me, like my turn, right? And the baker saw that Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation. He said to Joseph, "I had a dream too. In my dream, there were 3 baskets of white pastries stacked on my head. The top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head." Kind of like, okay, so is this true? Is this going to be like my promotion? And Joseph's like, well, not exactly. What will happen is, here's what the dream means. The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole. Then birds will come and peck away at your flesh. This, again, is why he could not get a job at the Hallmark card factory. They don't make those little Valentine hearts with this written on them. No, So we've got 2 guys, 2 dreams, both of which have this 3-day timeline. And so Joseph is now hoping that if these dreams do in fact come true, that maybe the cupbearer will be his secret to getting out of this prison after, we don't even know how long he's been in there at this particular juncture. So, verse 20, Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later. 3 days, notice the timeline. He prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials, brought them out of prison. Notice that. Verse 21, he then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position. So he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. The dream is coming true. And verse 22, but Pharaoh impaled the chief cupbearer, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Can you imagine being the baker, by the way, like being brought out of prison, thinking, okay, is this going to actually happen? Like, what's going on here? And he sees the cupbearer getting promoted, and now like his knees are knocking together, thinking, okay, is that pole over there? Is that like for a party game, or is that for me? And it turns out to be for the chief baker. The dreams that Joseph interpreted have now come true. Verse 23, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Again, spoiler alert, we don't know how long he's been in prison so far, but he's got at least 2 more years ahead of him. 2 more years to rot in the Egyptian prison. I don't care how good of a status he's got as the chief of among, all the other inmates. He's going to be just languishing in the Egyptian prison. So we've seen the cupbearer's dream has been interpreted faithfully, and it came true. We've seen the baker's dream interpreted faithfully, and it came true. We've seen Joseph making his request, and his request forgotten. And you can imagine that as he is languishing there in the Egyptian prison, if he is finding himself wondering, okay, God, these other dreams came true. When is it my turn? Because Joseph had that dream of his long before now, of course. Back when he was a 17-year-old kid, he had dreams of his own. And those dreams have yet to be fulfilled. And so here we find Joseph sitting and languishing, recognizing that he is not where he wants to be, but he is where God needs him to be. And God needed him to be there, at least in that moment, if for no other reason than to show others that yes, he is capable of interpreting God's will and plan, and that yes, he does have a reason to be there because this is where God wants him for the moment. That will become a little more clear as we proceed in our series and even proceed this morning. Sometimes you and I will find ourselves in circumstances that don't make sense. Sometimes we'll be in circumstances that don't make sense and will actually be painful to live in, whether it's illness, whether it's that prolonged waiting for whatever it may be that you're waiting to come along. When our dreams do not come true, we experience frustration, anger, resentment, jealousy, but it could be that even though I am not where I want to be, that I'm where God needs me to be. And instead of arguing and just trying to see my story from my own vantage point, that I step back far enough and recognize that maybe God has something larger at work that I can't quite see yet. Like we're in the middle of our story, every single one of us. We don't know how God is going to write the script from here until the day of eternity. And because of that, there might be situations that you find yourself in that don't make sense in the here and now, but we can be grateful for because we know that God is shaping our stories for his glory and for our good. Christy Nelson is the director of an organization called A Network for Grateful Living. And when she was 33, she received a cancer diagnosis that required multiple surgeries, chemo, and radiation. And she says that even though all of those experiences were deeply painful and deeply grievous, she said that she found opportunities daily to search out reasons for gratitude. She says this, I was in the hospital, separated from all my friends and family, and tethered to all kinds of IVs and dealing with pain. And yet, I had nurses and technicians and doctors and cleaners who came into my room every single day. I remember thinking, what if this is my whole world now? What if this is all I have? And then I thought, I can always love these people. That's gratitude. That's mercy. That's allowing God to use someone in a way that they need to be used, even when they're in a situation and circumstance they don't want to be in. If you are facing something like that now, whether it's illness, whether it's some kind of odd, awkward family dynamic, it could be that, yes, this is an undesirable circumstance, but God can use you to minister and love others in the midst of all that tragedy and all that brokenness. And part of the reason for that is as we examine this story kind of in light of the gospel, we'll see two other major truths emerge that help us to reframe our own circumstances and our own experience of waiting for God to come through. And the second thing is simply this, that today is not forever. Today is not forever. The situation you are in now will not always be your circumstance or your story. Today is not forever. If you look, in fact, at the Joseph story, you start to see that God is already orchestrating events in his life for his glory and for Joseph's good. Okay? Think of it this way. When Joseph was still living in the land of Canaan and he had the dreams about his family bowing down, we observed a few weeks ago that in that ancient patriarchal, hierarchical society, it would be absolutely absurd and culturally impossible for his older siblings to bow down to the younger brother. Culturally impossible. If we know the story of Joseph well, we know the only way for this to ever happen is if Joseph is in some way enthroned as Egyptian royalty. The only way his dream ever comes true is because he eventually ascends to the throne as prince over Egypt. And as we look at Joseph's story, even so far, every bad thing that's happened so far has been inching him ever closer to that day when the dreams will one day be fulfilled. He's in prison now, but look where he is. Being sold by his brothers brought him to Egypt. Being put into Potiphar's house was a means to an end. He got put in prison, but whose prison? Prison under Pharaoh. He's now adjacent to the king who will one day promote him. Every time something bad happens in Joseph's life, we see that God has his invisible hand at work behind the scenes, inching him ever closer to the day that one day his plan, his dream, his vision will be fulfilled. Not all of us have a clear dream in front of us to know what's going on in front of our faces. Not all of us have a clear destiny in mind. Not all of us have a clear ending to our story like Joseph, but we can all look for signs of God working behind the scenes in our life so that we can see that our circumstance has meaning and depth that goes beyond our initial surface level understanding. Let me give you an example here. So a number of years ago, there was a U.S. Navy vice admiral who was captured during the Vietnam War, and he spent 7 years as a POW during the Vietnam War. And as he observed other prisoners of war, and he saw who lived and who did not survive the experience, he said that the people who did not survive all had one common element. What it was? They were all optimists. The people who did not survive were optimists. They were telling themselves this story that they'll be out by Christmas, or they'll be out by Easter, or they'll be out by the next Christmas or Thanksgiving. And then it would be Christmas or Thanksgiving or Easter, and they wouldn't get out, and their heart eventually broke. Their spirits broke. Optimism, telling yourself this Pollyanna-esque story of how things will all work out in the end, that doesn't always work out the way that you or I personally envision. Optimism can actually be fatal. There is a tragic optimism when we insist on telling God what the best ending to the story might be. Contrast that with Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of Auschwitz in World War II. He has a very important book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he says that the people who survived Auschwitz were those who were able to look at their circumstance, not to celebrate it, of course, but to find meaning in the midst of it, that God is somehow still at work, even in the context of suffering. Listen, there will be Christians out there will be pastors and teachers out there on the TV airwaves who tell you things like, listen, everything happens for a reason. If you can just have enough faith, God will heal you, God will bless you, you'll have a big bank account, everything will work out fine. And that kind of naive, tragic optimism may or may not work out on the stage of everyday real experience. But if we can look at God's larger perspective, his larger aim to bring wholeness and redemption to the world through his Son, then we can find meaning and purpose and value in every circumstance that you and I are facing, even if we can't see the end of the story. That's what we can say. And because today is not forever. And even if the circumstance you're in leads to death, we all know what God does with dead things. Yet, that even if my circumstance, if I leave here today and I crash out and I bleed out in some ditch somewhere, that my story, that is not the end of my story for me as a Christian, that the end of my story is being safe in my Father's arms and knowing that God has a plan to redeem and restore all of creation so that everything in our world can be restored to its perfection and beauty and the way that God always intended for it to be. If we are down, if we are wondering how God could be at work, we can always know that no matter what else, we can be confident that God is working all things for his glory and for our good, and that God wins in the end. Third, you are never forgotten. Today is not forever, and you are never forgotten. The cupbearer got what he wanted from Joseph and then moved on. He forgot him entirely. And as we said, Joseph languishes for at least another 2 years in that Egyptian prison. That's a long time to be forgotten. And over time, you can imagine how Joseph might have had experiences of resentment or wondering, wow, how in the world could he have possibly forgotten about me? And just that frustration of feeling like, listen, when is it my turn? And you and I might feel occasionally forgotten, either by our boss, by our significant other, by our kids, by our family, even forgotten by God. And here's the thing. You are never forgotten by God. God sees and God knows. I know that can be challenging from an intellectual and an experiential perspective, because there are plenty of folks out there who feel like, listen, I have gone to church all of my life. I have done all the right things. I put money in the offering plate. I sang in worship. I went to Sunday school. I did all the things I was supposed to do. So why didn't God heal my brother? Or why didn't God come through for my sister? Why didn't God come through for me? And here's the difficult answer that I have for you. And the answer is I don't know exactly. I don't always know exactly why God does any one particular thing, or why God doesn't answer prayers the way that we always want him to answer them. But here's what I do know. I know that it's better to go through those circumstances with God than without him. Because here's why. If you are a completely skeptical, secular person, if you want to just write God out of the equation entirely, you are left looking for meaning anywhere you possibly can find it, and you usually won't find it at all. Larissa McFarquhar, who was a writer for the Boston Review, she said that religion does a much better job of explaining suffering than anything else in the world. Like if you are an atheist, or if you are just an agnostic, then when suffering comes, you have to conclude that it's just a random accident in an arbitrary universe. But if you are a religious person, then you can find meaning and purpose and value in your suffering, knowing that God has a deeper plan for it all, even if you don't know what that plan exactly is. And because of the gospel, we know that we are personally known and loved and remembered by a creator who has known us all of our lives. Psalm 139, verse 1 through 16 says this. I'll just read a few selections. The psalmist says, "O Lord, You have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. There is nothing that happens in your life that will ever indicate that God does not see and God does not know. You are known, you are loved, even in the midst of these storms and circumstances and waiting periods of your life. God sees, God knows, you are remembered, you are never forgotten. And that allows us then to not waste our wait, to not waste those periods of waiting, to not waste the times that we have when things seem uncertain or unpleasant. There was a writer years ago named Gordon MacDonald. He was actually C.S. Lewis's favorite fiction writer. And he told this short story called The Princess and the Goblin. And in this, it was a fairy tale kind of a thing. And in the fairy tale, the young girl Irene meets her magical grandmother. And her magical grandmother gives her a ring. And the ring has attached to it a slender, invisible thread. Irene can touch and feel the thread, even though she cannot see the thread. And her grandmother tells her, if things ever go south, if things ever go bad, what you should do is this. Take the ring off and put the ring under your pillow. And then you can feel the thread and follow the thread. And I'm holding the other end of the thread with a little ball of thread on the end. And all you have to do is follow that thread, and you will find me in the end. And so one night, because it's a fairy tale story, a whole group or herd or whatever the word is, the whole group of goblins break into Irene's house. And so she does what her grandmother taught her to do. She takes off the ring, puts it under her pillow, and starts to follow her thread, looking for her grandmother. And to her astonishment, the thread leads her out of the home and to the actual cave where the goblins originated. And she's astonished by this, because how in the world could her grandmother lead her into further danger? But she trusts her grandmother, and she keeps on going. And she reaches the edge of the cave where she has to tear down rocks that are blocking the way. And as she tears down the rocks, she finds a friend of hers inside the cave, and she's able to rescue her friend Curdy, who had been kidnapped by the goblins earlier. Because she had trusted her grandmother, she followed the thread into danger, and she fulfilled a purpose for her and her friend. And so as her friend Curdy says, okay, let's get out of here, let's go back to the mouth of the cave, Irene says, no, I must follow the thread. And she goes further into the cave, following that thread, because she says, I have to trust my grandmother. There will be times, there will be seasons when following God will make no sense to you whatsoever. There will be times in your life when following God will actually be painful, and it will not make sense to you, and it will be difficult to bear emotionally, socially, occupationally, whatever. Following God is worth it. It's worth it. We don't follow Jesus because he makes life better. We follow Jesus because he is bigger than life itself. We follow that thread. We know that at the other end of that thread is someone who loves us immeasurably. We know that at the other end of that thread is someone who's already been down the exact same paths that we have been down, who has suffered like we have suffered, although more so. And we know that at the end of that thread, we find our Savior, we find Jesus, we find the Father's love. And because of that, the waiting doesn't have to be so hard, knowing that in the end, God wins, that we are known, we are loved, and in him we find all the blessings, all the desires our heart ever had. Amen? Father, I ask that if there's anyone in this room today who is experiencing a period of waiting, a period of uncertainty, that you give them comfort knowing that even amidst the darkness of our prison cell or our traffic jam or whatever else, that you are there, that we are seen, we are loved, that today is not the end of our journey, and that we are not forgotten by you. Lord, help us to be men and women who express gratitude for these small things that we find even during these seasons, and that we can show love to others as we tell your story as we endure these seasons. Lord, lift up our voices in these next songs, that we sing these songs as anthems of those who have been saved and redeemed from this dark world and know there's a better ending down the way. We ask all these things in your Son's name and by your Spirit's power. Amen.